All right, that was a lot smoother than in my head. That was less smooth. So we're finally here. We're at the final countdown for overviewing all the passages that people like to bring up in opposition to the single covenant Israel only position, um, which is the entirety of the book of Hebrews. Now we're not going to go over the entire book of Hebrews. That's not the point. The point is that the author is going to go over specific parts of the book of Hebrews that people think support that we're under a new covenant, and we're going to be analyzing them contextually, grammatically, and linguistically, although we're not going to get too much into the language. And of course, this is adapted from Christopher Cohn's chapter. I think he did a pretty good job, and it's by me, right? So we've already gone through the Lord's Supper, right? It's been cooked. We realize that's not what it's talking about. It's not saying we're partaking of the new covenant. It's saying that we look forward to the installment of the new covenant for Israel when he comes back. We went over Romans 11. We show that that's not even talking about salvation or the new covenant mostly. That's just talking about participation in mediatorial blessings. And then we went over even 2 Corinthians 3:6. We realized it's not talking about we're ministers of a new covenant in that we're ministering the new covenant, but we're ministers of a new covenant like ministry. It's a metaphor. It's not talking about the content, right? That's a short. If you want to go into it in depth, we have presentations on that as well. Now, this is going to be the last presentation in our short section, which is 4 presentations, going over the new covenant passages in the New Testament. While the other 3 covered simple verses, this one covers an entire book. However, we only need to go over chapters 7 to 10 and probably chapter 12 briefly, although I don't think that'll add much. We'll demonstrate why Hebrews does not teach under the new covenant in any way. In fact, it doesn't not only Hebrews doesn't demonstrate we're under the new covenant, and in fact, it demonstrates we're not under the new covenant, right? It actually helps toward our position. We'll demonstrate also how it actually maintains the original recipients of the new covenant promises, which are Israel and Judah. And then, of course, all credit goes to the original authors and the general editor, which is Christopher Cohn as well. Right? All right. Epic sweater. Thank you for that. So, why the book of Hebrews? Right? What's so important about it? It's because the new covenant actually enjoys more prominence in this book than any other book in the New Testament. There are actually 6 direct and indirect references to it in other places, which is the Synoptic Gospels, Romans 11, 1 Corinthians 11, and 2 Corinthians 3:6. We've gone over all of these, by the way. 3 of which are from Paul. 1 is a quotation from the 3 and other firms. It's a future. However, Hebrews contains around 10. Get that, 10 direct references to the new covenant and an exclusive quote of Jeremiah 31. This is specifically in Hebrews 7, Hebrews 8, 6 to 12, Hebrews 9, 15, Hebrews 10, 9, which we're going to get into that, Hebrews 10, 16 to 17, Hebrews 12, 24, and Hebrews 13, 20. Because of its quotations, many suspect that this means the church must relate to the new covenant in some way. And dispensationalists usually have a pretty hard time figuring out whether you're multi-user, whether you're a participant, right? Whether you take a fulfillment in part view. Everyone has some way that they try to accommodate those promises for the church. However, is this what the author is really trying to communicate to us? And so what we're going to ask here is what we've been asking through our entire series is, for what saith the scriptures? Romans 4:3. Now, there are some contextual considerations. The point of the book is that the author wants to convince his readers of the superiority of Christ. Now, specifically with the exhortations, he wants them to pay attention, consider him and don't grow weary, to beware, to fear, to be diligent to enter the rest, to consider one another to love and good works, to not forsake the gathering of ourselves, to lay aside every weight of sin, etc., etc., right? All of these exhortations in the book. Now, in chapters 1 to 6, we have no less than 11 exhortations, and there's a brief interlude against apostasy and a lack of growing in maturity in 5:12 to 6:20. But in chapters 10 to 13, we have no less than 27 exhortations. And so the book of the actual doctrinal section of the book, which is the part of the doctrinal section, which also includes the New Covenant, is in chapters 7:1 to 10:18, and it actually has no exhortations in it. You can look at all of the commands and the subjunctives, and the hortatory subjunctives and the imperatives. There's actually none of those in that section. But even after that long section, Hebrews 10:19 to 22 says that we enter in by a new and living way. Now, I will say, if that new and living way is the new covenant, then the matter is settled. We are a direct participant of the new covenant. But if it's not the new covenant, then what is the new way? Right? Makes sense. And how does it relate to the new covenant? Because it does relate to the new covenant in some way, but not in the way you're thinking. So there's a few things to consider, right? The point of the book is to argue that Christ is superior to everything before him, right? Specifically, the comparisons are Christ versus the angels, right? In Hebrews chapter 1 and 2. Christ versus the prophets, which is Hebrews 1, 1 and 2, right? He spoke to us by the fathers, but now he speaks to us by his son. Hebrews and Moses, which is the Moses from the Prince of Egypt, if you've seen that movie. Moses versus Levitical sacrifices, which is the goat down there. And then Christ versus Levi, right? Or the Levitical priest, which if you've seen Attack on Titan, you know who that character is. That's just an image that I found. That was a PNG. Now, with all of these excellent contrasts in the book, it only makes sense that we should respond appropriately, right? It only makes sense that in seeing the superiority of Christ, okay, he's better than everything that came before him. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? But it does mean that we should respond appropriately, because if we don't, there's a worse judgment than death. Now, I don't believe that that's hell. That's a more free grace issue. But still, it remains, the New Testament has worse judgments for Christians in some sense. But of course, if everything about him is better, it also makes sense the punishments for apostasy are worse, right? However, we're not going to go into those warning passages. That's not the point of this. We're not even going to go exactly who the audience is. I personally think it's only believing Jews, but that's not entirely relevant, right? But if the writer of Hebrews wanted to make the point that he was superior to the priesthood, what would he say exactly, right? What would he bring up as chief evidence to support the superiority of Christ, right? Now, Reformed and dispensationalist thinkers have pondered the way that Christ's new covenant mediatorship pertains to the church, right? So there's a few perspectives on the book of Hebrews in terms of the new covenant. So you see here, it's sort of like if you're looking at an elephant, okay? In an elephant, you have, everyone has their eyes closed. If you look at its side, oh, it's a wall. If you look at the tail, oh, it's a rope. If you look at its legs, oh, you'll think it's a tree, right? It's very rigid. But in reality, they're just looking at different things they're just looking at the same thing, but from a different perspective, and they're coming to different conclusions. We got to step back and we got to look at the whole picture, right? And so Kenneth Barker, who is progressive, he actually cites Hebrews 8 to 10 to support that there are two eras, the Old and the New Covenant, and a present form of the Messianic era is present. Gentry and Wellham, who are New Covenant theologians, says that the Hebrews supports a direct application to the church from Christ's New Covenant. Fruchtenbaum, who is a classical dispensationalist, he said that the church received blessings from the New Covenant, but they do not fulfill the New Covenant. That's his opinion. Now, Elliot Johnson, interestingly, he uses Hebrews 9:16 to 17, that one particular passage, to say that the New Covenant presently functions, so he believes that it's presently in force, as a last will and testament and given in the gospel message. Almost every position and author will try to relegate the church to the New Covenant. But is this exegetically necessary? That's the question we have to ask. Does it require me, as an exegete, to place the church under the New Covenant, or is there a better and more exegetical way? So the question is, why is there so much disconnect, right? Why is there so much disconnect between the progressives and the dispensational authors on this issue, while the covenant theologians are pretty cut and dry, right? The covenant theologians basically all say that, yeah, we're under new covenant, we fulfill it, we're the new Israel, et cetera, right? However, most have no problem seeing an already not yet with regards to the new covenant. And we've already seen before in our presentations how that doesn't really work. I don't believe that that's hermeneutically required, and it's also just irresponsible. Now, John Walvoord, when talking about the book of Hebrews, actually asks 3 key questions to help us identify as we go to the next 4 chapters in this study. Number 1, are any promises given to Israel under the new covenant operative today in any form? Number 2, how does Hebrews use the term new covenant either directly or indirectly? And number 3, what is the explicit teaching of Hebrews about the new covenant? Christopher Cone, in the original work, went very Greek heavy in this section. But I'm gonna personally spare you some of my bad pronunciations and the Greek lesson for the most part. I don't think that it's relevant. But again, you can look at the Greek for yourself in that book. So starting off, Hebrews 7:11 to 28, which is really the bulk of the section. The author builds off of a point previously established in Hebrews 5:10, that he is a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. But Hebrews 7:12 asserts that because of this, there's also a necessity, a change in the law. But it should be noted that this does not mean a shift in the law. It's only departing from one law to another law. The law still exists, but there's now a new law in place, right? Christ became a priest after the order of an everlasting life, not by the power of any law. Why? Because the law made nothing perfect, including the very priests that it organized. Therefore, there's the introduction of a better hope by which we draw near to God. Now, Rodney Decker, who's progressive, believes that this better hope is the better covenant that Jesus is a surety of in verse 22. But there's a few assumptions here, right? And exegetical problems. For one, the assumption is that the better hope is the better covenant, right? But again, as we've said before, if that's the case, then we are directly benefiting from the covenant. If not, then we have to identify it as something else. But the text doesn't even indicate that. It doesn't even make that point, right? Hebrews 7:22 is a side point about his better covenant, even if they're mentioned closely together. And there's also like a bunch of other things mentioned as better in the book of Hebrews, right? There's better things, better hope, better covenant, better promises, a better sprinkled blood than that of Abel, a better position in heaven, a better country that we look forward to, a better resurrection, and something better provided for us, right? So if we actually continue on, Kostenberger, who does not take the Israel-only view, but he also sees the better hope and better covenant as parallel expressions, but he actually concedes that conclusion, right? Because he says that the point of the book of Hebrews is to emphasize the better quality of every element between the old system and the new. And he concludes that because Christ is superior to the old system in every way, nothing less will do than complete obedience and faithful allegiance in both belief and practice to the one who is the new and better way. So he even concedes in his own book, just a few pages later, that Christ is the better way. Christ is the better hope that comes in. And it's not just about one system over another. It's about the superiority of Christ over everything. And specifically, 719 and 725 are actually semantically parallel in terms of the drawing near, which the present indicative is the same moving forward present participle, which means that our conclusion is clear. The better hope through which we draw near is Jesus Christ, not the covenant he mediates, which you can see from this picture on the side that everything points back to him being better. Now, there's even more support for this view because David MacLeod, in the literary structure of the book of Hebrews, observes an important aspect of the adversative participle in the book. If we observe these contrasts that Hebrews lays out, it'll be easier to see that Christ is that better hope, right? We have in 1:7, angels are to minister. 1:8, Jesus is to rule. In 3:5, Moses is a faithful servant, but Jesus is a son, right? The sons of Levi are contrasted with Melchizedek. Mortal men receive tithes, but Melchizedek received a tithe. There's a setting aside of the weak commandment, and there's the establishing of a better hope. Without hope, they became priests, but Jesus became a priest. Priests died, but Jesus lives forever. And therefore, at the conclusion of the matter, Jesus can save completely those who draw near to God through him. And so in every instance leading up to 725, it always refers to the superior person, not the superior covenant or the superior, non-person, I guess you could say, the superior regular noun. So, and then the second assumption is that the law being annulled means that it's replaced. And so a better hope is introduced, right? Don't get me wrong, but it hasn't replaced the old commandment. The law still had a purpose. According to Hebrews 10:1, it's to serve as a shadow of good things to come. But the better hope has another purpose, and it's to bring us near to God. Experientially, in my personal view, I don't believe that's about positional salvation. Now, if we want to argue that there's a new law in force, we also have to say all aspects of the law are introduced. You can't just pick and choose which parts of the law you want introduced for the church, which parts you want to leave for Israel, right? It comes as a package deal. And so this would actually make the church fulfill the new covenant, not just an indirect recipient of it, like Elliot Johnson likes to say. And so, therefore, we should not too closely associate the Melchizedekian priesthood with the new covenant, in my opinion, right? Jesus Christ is the eternal high priest, right, after Melchizedek, but we already noted that doesn't mean that he rules now on David's throne, right? He doesn't rule over his messianic kingdom, even though he is a king priest, right? Now, when answering Walworth's question about Hebrews 7, well, are any promises given to Israel under the new covenant today operative? No, but the mediator is identified as the means by which we draw near to God. How does Hebrews use the term new covenant? Either directly or indirectly. Jesus is the guarantee of a better covenant, but the attention is on Christ rather than the covenant. And number 3, what is the explicit teaching of Hebrews about the new covenant? The new covenant is evidence of Jesus' superiority in that he is able to save completely all those who draw near to God through him. That's all you can get from Hebrews chapter 7. So in Hebrews chapter 8, this is where things get actually very interesting. The rest of the chapter forms a cohesive section on how and why Jesus is a better high priest. That's the point of it. Hebrews 8, 1 and 2 form the main point, not only of the previous section, but I would even argue the entire book, right? Which is that he ministers in heaven in a true unshakable tabernacle. There's actually a lot of theological significance with the idea that it's a tabernacle, not a temple, but that's not entirely relevant for our discussion here. The author gives 3 reasons why Christ's priesthood is superior. Number 1, he's attained a better ministry. Number 2, he's a better covenant mediator. And number 3, that covenant is established on better promises. And so importantly, there has to be a distinguishing between the idea of promises, plural, which is general, and promise, which is very specific. So the singular is used 8 times in the book, as you can see here, but the plural is only used 6 times in the book. And so the better promises in view are just a reiteration of the Jeremiah 31 New Covenant, which is verses 8 to 12, which is just a direct quotation. However, different commentators and theologians understand the idea of established a new covenant in diverse ways, and it's kind of a pivot point in this specific chapter. So Roy Beecham, who's Israel only, he sees this as given but not in force from Hebrews 7:11, which uses the same word in the singular for the law, which means that, again, the law was given, but it wasn't in force until the covenant was oathed. Elliot Johnson sees a distinction between ratified and inaugurated. So he sees it as the covenant is ratified, but it's not inaugurated yet. And so it's presently functioning, but not presently fulfilled. That's how he sees it. Rodney Decker just straight up uses the word enacted and enforced. So personally, I can agree that the term itself doesn't tell you anything about whether it's a past fulfillment or present fulfillment. And so I would even say that everything has been in place for the covenant to be cut with Israel, right? You have the high priestly ministry, you have the blood for the forgiveness of sins, the Jesus Christ mediator from heaven, right? All of the things are in place for the covenant to happen. So we could say that it's been established, but that doesn't mean that the blessings are in place. The blessings are very specific and for a very specific purpose. A covenant cannot have its blessings enjoined without being fulfilled. There's actually no reason you can make that distinction. Unless there's serious exegetical reason to consider that, right? A lot of dispensations like to say that. I don't think that that's true at all. And so in terms of the Jeremiah 31 quotation, it's important to note that just because there's a second covenant, that doesn't mean there's a replacement of the old covenant, right? When Hebrews quotes the new covenant, it doesn't expand on the recipients. It doesn't create a different distinction of types of blessings, right? Or anything like that. And according to our friend, Mr. Incredible here, he says math is math. Well, I say Israel is Israel, right? The church is not in view in that passage. In fact, when speaking of the old covenant, the writer is actually very careful to say that it hasn't disappeared, but it's ready to disappear. And it wasn't made old the moment Christ died. It was made old the moment it was announced, like 600 years before. And so it still was not replaced by the time the writer had written the letter. And presumably that's the case today. I don't believe that it ended in the destruction of Jerusalem. There's no reason to assume that. The destruction of the temple and divine discipline does not somehow end the old covenant, right? Israel was constantly divinely disciplined and their covenant still stayed intact. And so then we have Walvoord's questions in this chapter. Number one, are any promises given to Israel under the new covenant operative today? No, all the original recipients of timing is left intact. How does Hebrews use the term new covenant, either directly or indirectly? The term is used both directly and indirectly, and in each case, the antecedent is obvious. New and old, first and second. And then number three, what is the explicit teaching of Hebrews about the new covenant? There is no new teaching about the Hebrews and the new covenant. It's cited as a contrast to the old in order to reinforce that Jesus Christ is better in every way. The covenant has legitimately been paid for and ratified, but there's nothing that expands or fulfills the promises of the new covenant. And so, just as a recap over here, because some people might get confused, the idea is that going from Hebrews 7 to 8, which is halfway through, we're just seeing that Hebrews is using it as a way to extol the superiority of Christ. And that's particularly relevant to his readership who were considering going back to sacrifices. But he's saying, no, look, because number one, Christ is better than the sacrifices. Number two, he's a better priest. And number three, because if you do, you'll face a worse judgment, right? If you abandon Christ. So I think that that's the whole point of the book. The whole point of the book is not even to talk about the covenant. It's a side point, really, in the whole discussion. So Hebrews 9, 1 to 28. So Hebrews 9, 1 begins with the hook word going back to the previous chapter, which provides more support for Jesus' superiority and why his mediatorship is better. So the limitations of the old are pretty apparent in the first part of the chapter. The priests had to continually enter in for sacrifices, which is the sacrifices you see in the background there. That's a sheep. I believe it's a lamb. The high priest had to enter in year by year into the holiest, but it could not solve their sin problem. And the old covenant was inherently temporal, and it would prefigure the new order. However, the Holy Spirit signified that there would be a way into the holiest that would be eventually revealed. However, Jesus, on the other hand, is a high priest of good things to come. Now, according to the author's view, and according to my view as well, these good things have not yet come, right? According to Hebrews 10:1, when it talks about it in the future aspect, these good things are yet to come, right? However, the emphasis is not on the good things, but on the person who brings in those good things, right? And so he entered in once into the tabernacle and obtained eternal redemption. But what is the eternal redemption here? So if you've ever played the game Red Dead Redemption, which I have, it's actually pretty good. You'll know that Arthur Morgan rides on a horse into the sunset to kill some to unalive some cowboys, right? And that's his redemption. But who's the redemption for in Hebrews chapter 9? So most Christians think that the idea of eternal redemption has to do with personal salvation. Now, is it possible? Yeah, it's possible that might be the case. But I would argue, and as well as the author, that it's actually something different here. See, David Allen proposes that the language of Luke 1 and the accomplished redemption for his people is the same redemption spoken of here. In fact, Luke and Hebrews tend to use a lot of the same language. And in fact, this further reinforces that the future hope and new covenant is for Israel, not a present fulfillment. And so therefore, when Christ died, he obtained eternal redemption, which is the eternal salvation for the Israelites in the future, right? He's done everything to do that, but that eternal redemption is not necessarily for Christians, right? Because that's national redemption. Yes, there is redemption through his blood in other places, but that is for personal salvation, right? And so even more comments on Jesus' blood. Hebrews 9 is a very blood-heavy chapter. Jesus' blood, which cleanses the conscience from dead works, is in contrast to the blood of the old covenant, which cleanses the flesh for purification. The point is, once again, that the person is better because their blood is better. And so therefore, because of this, he's the mediator of a new covenant. Why? For the redemption of transgressions committed under the first covenant. See, he gives you very specific scope of what he's accomplishing here. He's accomplishing not the sin of all ages in this particular chapter, but the sins committed in the nation of Israel and for her national forgiveness, right? Again, the focus in this verse is on the sins committed under the first covenant. And so the consequence of his death is that those called would receive an eternal inheritance. Now, what's interesting is that in 2:11, the infinitive is used of Christ sanctifying and calling believers his brethren. In Hebrews 5:4, the calling is to his priesthood. But in 11:8, it's interesting. Abraham was called to obey and to go to a land for an inheritance. In 11:18, Isaac's descendants would be called. In Hebrews 6:12-17, we're exhorted to be imitators of those who were called and inherited the promises. The internal inheritance, at least in my view, as well as the authors, is probably a promise of reward based on their faithful obedience. However, the distinction in 1139 between the Old Testament believers and the New Testament believers in the church is still maintained. You still have us versus them, right? Not in terms of verses, but in terms of a distinction there, right? And so there's actually two groups, not one merged group. And so in Hebrews 9:11-15, 9:1-15, it's followed by puzzling statements about how a covenant is, question, in force after one has died, right? However, all we know is that the covenant is in force after death, but there's no indication of who or what must die. And so he kind of lists the verses 18-22, and he cites law as a principle for the shedding as necessary to validate the Mosaic covenant. Now, we already went over this in our section on the Lord's Supper. The idea is that, yes, the blood is can be necessary for some covenants. It can be a special ceremonial thing, but the actual covenant is in force after an oath, right? And I believe that's what's going on in the new covenant as well. Now, Robert Anderson and Elliot Johnson try to make the distinction by the KJV use of the word covenant and testament. But Rodney Decker, and I would agree with him here, he actually calls this extremely highly improbable because this is a random switch up for the author, right? There's no indication at all that they're distinct from verse 15 to verse 16. Christ went into the tabernacle to ratify the new covenant with his blood and now appears before God before his heavenly ministry then. So these two events are actually distinct, but they are connected in some way. And so in my opinion, I think when it's talking about how a covenant is in force after one is dead, first of all, that's not always true. Some covenants in the Old Testament are in force after an oath, or they don't even have blood at all, right? They're just regular covenants, agreements between two individuals. However, I think when it talks about a testament here, it's just giving a general statement about testaments, right? Because in a general testament and will, the person who had written the will, they would have to die physically for the people to get those blessings, right? But he's just kind of making it, I think Hebrews is just making a general statement here, not making a statement about when the new covenant is fulfilled, right? It's just saying a death must take place in this particular instance, right? Which again, yes, everything has been done to ratify the new covenant, but the enactment is still in the future. Now, again, we're going back to Walvert's questions for chapter 9. Are any promises given to Israel under the new covenant operative today in any form? No, with the exception of Hebrews 9:15, keeping the original recipients of the new covenant intact. Only by theological argumentation can we say that verses 16-17 denote a present force of the covenant in testament form. And so question 2, how does Hebrews use the term new covenant, either directly or indirectly? The term is used both directly or indirectly, and in each case, the antecedent is pretty obvious. It's either new and old, or it's the first and the second. And number 3, what is the explicit teaching of Hebrews about the new covenant? There actually is no new teaching of the new covenant here compared to the previous chapters. It's cited as a contrast to the old in order to reinforce, again, Jesus is better. He's a better everything. It's validated by the blood of Christ, just like the law was validated in Exodus 24, but it doesn't mean that they're exact parallels, right, between the old and the new. The old was being fulfilled by Israel's obedience, and they got blessing because of it, but there's actually no conditions given in the new covenant except for some eschatological timings. right? Once the covenant is in force, when Israel repents, then it's from there on unconditional, right? Now, in Hebrews 10, 1 to 18, which is our last section we're going to get into, the evidence for the law's inferiority is that the priests had to continually offer year by year the same sacrifices, which is verses 2 and 3. Why? Because they could not take away sin. Now, most people think that this is talking about, I'm just going to give my opinion. Most people think this is talking about salvation, that they thought that they could not give salvation. I mean, it's not really salvation. I don't think that they thought that they could actually save themselves because of sacrifices. I don't think anyone really thought that. However, when it says they can't take away sin, it's more talking about the guilt of sin. It's more talking about the uncleanliness of sin and how you couldn't be cleansed in order to enter the presence of God. I think that's the main point. But again, that's a side point. And so the evidence for this is that God did not desire sin offerings, but a body, soma. And so the author equates the Septuagint use of Psalms 40:6-8, but replaces the word ear, which is etia, with the word body, or soma. This is a correct interpretation of the point of the psalm, since opening the ears is a Jewish idiom for full obedience of one's body. I got to check something real quick. Okay, good. Now, the will of the Father, right? Again, we immediately go to John 6:40 and try to answer this, but in Hebrews 10, it's something different. So what's the purpose of his death? Well, the purpose of his death is so that he might take away the first and establish the second. Now, it doesn't really say what the first and the second are, but the context is probably talking about the covenants. Although I do understand previously from another author, we saw that they were talking about the sacrifices. That could be the case here. But again, this is Christopher Cohn's view that we're representing. However, the manifold purpose of Jesus' death must be maintained and distinguished. The will includes taking away the first, but it also includes us personally being sanctified by Christ's body, not the covenant that he shed for it, not the covenant that made it possible. Right? If there was any place for the author to say we are sanctified by the new covenant, it would be here in this passage, but he doesn't. Right? Nowhere does he ever say in the book of Hebrews that we are sanctified by the covenant. We're sanctified by the blood of the covenant. Right? So again, important distinction there. The recipients of the covenant, which is they and them in verses 16 to 17, which goes back to chapter 8, is distinct from the us, right? So it witnesses to us. It's a good comparison of what's happening in the church, but like 2 Corinthians 3, but it doesn't denote fulfillment by the church, right? And in fact, Jesus's future Davidic ministry as a king, which is the same as new covenant timing, according to Romans chapter 11, is also emphasized, right? It says from Psalms 110 that sit thou at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool, right? Again, a future fulfillment. Again, everything has been set in place for the covenant to be cut with Israel and Judah, and so there's no more offering necessary, not only for the forgiveness of our sins, but also for the forgiveness of her sins, right? And so again, the point of this is showing that there's a distinction between us and them. There's a distinction between sanctified and the covenant. There's a distinction between the different purposes of Jesus's death, right? He doesn't just have one purpose for his death, like the covenant theologians, okay? And so as dispensationalists, we can understand these things, I think, in a more dynamic way. And so if we're going to wrap it all up together, right, we got to ask, well, what's the significance for the church age believer moving on from the new covenant, right? And so we can see that, number one, Jesus' death validates the new covenant and makes it a surety from Hebrews chapter 7. Number two, it proves God is faithful to his future promises for those who sin under the first covenant, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 15. Number three, it is the means by which we are eternally sanctified. I believe that's positional, but not strictly salvational, right? It's more related to how we approach God. Number four, it's the means by which we draw near to God. Number five, it proves his priesthood is superior to the Levitical priesthood. Number six, it gives us reason to consider and focus on him. And number seven, it lets us know that if we try to go back to the law, which is still active, but it only gives cursing, there's nothing for us there, but a certain fearful looking for judgment. However, none of these denote a necessity that the covenant has been cut or that we're enjoying its blessings. These are not saying the covenant is functioning, but that it's a good picture. Rather, it gives us more appreciation and gratitude for the one who is a consuming fire in Hebrews chapter 12. So let's go back to Walvert's questions one last time. Are any promises given to Israel under the new covenant operative today in any form? I would say no. There are no mentions of promises, but there is reference to the one who promised in Hebrews 10:23. The promises are not yet received, but they will be received in his timing and for his glory, according to Hebrews 11:39-40. How does Hebrews use the term new covenant, either directly or indirectly? The term is used both directly and indirectly. It's mentioned directly in 10:16, quoting Jeremiah 31, and it's only mentioned indirectly in 10:9, as we already saw. Now, in this chapter, what is the explicit teaching of Hebrews about the new covenant? Well, first, it's exhibit A of evidence for the superiority of Christ, right? If you had a court case and your thesis was Christ is better, he's a better priest than everything else that came before him. Well, what's your first point of evidence? You would plop down, look, he's a new covenant mediator. It's a better covenant on better promises, better than the old, right? According to Jeremiah 31. That doesn't mean that it's fulfilled. It means that it's good evidence. And so it's the reason that we should have confidence in him. And so it's the way that God fulfills his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob for the land grant. And finally, he gives us reason to be grateful and to focus on him and him alone, not the law of Moses. Now, for our concluding thoughts here, right? Even our concluding thoughts for our entire short part of this series, our concluding thoughts for all of the questions we've been answering. I'm not actually going to reiterate everything we've been saying, but I'm going to quote the scripture from Hebrews chapter 12:18-24. It says, "For you have not come unto the mount that might be touched, and that burned with fire, nor into blackness and darkness and tempest, and the sound of a trumpet and the voice of words, which voice they that heard entreated that the words should not be spoken unto them any more, for they could not endure that which was commanded. And if so, as a beast they might touch the mountain, it should be stoned, or thrust through with a dart. And so terrible was the sight of Moses that said, I exceedingly fear and quake. But you have come to Mount Zion, unto the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to an innumerable company of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn, whose names are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel." We haven't come to the new covenant. We've come to him. Now, the only thing I have to ask is, any questions? There's probably none because, again, I am excellent at explaining this stuff. Okay. Quad is already in the chat. All right. And God the Son, Jesus Christ saves. Doki's over there. They're probably not here anymore because that was a mid presentation, of course. But honestly, just going back over some stuff that I didn't really get to go over. Okay. What's interesting is that I was looking up. I was looking at Hebrews chapter 10, and I was like, wait, but if you go back to the original quotation, right, it doesn't use the same word for it doesn't use the word body, right? Now, yeah, an ear is part of a body, but I don't think that's the point. I think the point really that Hebrews is making is that, look, when David said this, yes, he was talking about himself, but in a grander sense, it can be applied to Christ, right? Because Christ is the one that obeyed the Father's will. He came into the world to do the law, and he ratified the new covenant by his blood. He sanctified us by his blood, etc. Right? It was good, just super dense. Yeah, don't worry. We're gonna go over some stuff. I'm gonna do a little bit of just going over some stuff we didn't get to go over. It was very dense because we're covering 4 chapters in like a 40-minute time span, so it makes sense. But that was something interesting I actually realized when I reread the Psalm and Hebrews 10. He was just basically saying, look, when he wrote this, it can be applied to Christ, right? And And of course, that's symbolic for one's body. I don't think that he was saying that now he reinterprets it. In fact, I don't think that any New Testament author reinterprets any of the Psalms to mean something different. I think they use application for the most part, unless it's like directly predictive, right? And yeah, and then the covenant versus testament thing. This one was confusing. I will say I don't think the point of Hebrews in Hebrews 9, 16 to 17, I don't think that's trying to argue that the covenant is enforced. I think it's making a comparison with how testaments, which is a will, are usually enforced after one dies, right? But again, not all covenants in the Bible are based on blood. Most aren't, right? There's actually very few that are based on blood. David didn't have one based on blood. Right, there's a covenant we saw, right, that Israel broke with another nation that wasn't based on blood, right? And so it depends on the context. I think you make a comparison with how a will works with how covenants generally work, like the one in the Old Testament. And so I don't think it's making a theological point about the new covenant, though. Not too satisfied with the general statement with the about will versus testament. Probably going to read more about Son of the Great question people about their covenantal beliefs. That you addressed it. Yeah. Yeah. I think basically because the actual passage just says, "For a covenant is in force, or a testament is in force." The word is diathekes. A covenant is in force after one is dead, but for it, it's not in force while the testator lives, right? But the testator living, again, in this context, it would be Moses, right? But Moses didn't really die, right? Moses, after he sprinkled the blood on the altar and sprinkled the blood on the people, that's when it was enforced, not after he died. So again, I think it's just making a comparison language, not giving a strict theological point. And even then, the Mosaic covenant and the Old and the New covenant are not exactly the same, right? The Mosaic covenant is progressively fulfilled throughout history, according to Deuteronomy 28 to 30, whereas the New covenant, it comes in force at a specific point in time. So there's that. Same thing with the Abrahamic covenant. Abrahamic covenant is progressively fulfilled in Israel's history as they're blessed, and also through the church, but ultimately it culminates in the Messianic kingdom, right? So there's that. Now, the idea of being called, I used to think that was talking about Christians. It can include Christians, but I think that really it's talking about the fulfillment of the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, which is the land, right? Those who are called are probably more focusing on Old Testament saints, but there's Hebrews 3:1 says that we received a heavenly calling. You can receive an inheritance in the Messianic kingdom by your obedience. That's not salvation. That's just like it's a reward, right? That's the idea. And that's part of the reason why Jesus died. Jesus died to bring in the Messianic kingdom, right? And so that's a part of the reason why he died. That's part of the reason why the new covenant is in place. But again, I think the focus here on Hebrews 9:15 is the Old Testament saints like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that were called, right? Dr. Dean says it best: if this is the kingdom, I must be, I must be in the hood. Oh, I'm not just in the hood. I must be in. I'm not even in the ghetto. I'm probably in the slums, man. That sucks. Redemption for who? Yeah, the eternal redemption thing. Hopefully, you understood that. I think that there's a distinct. Which is interesting. I used to think the same way. Like now, is it possible that it could refer to eternal redemption? See, the thing is, the KJV says it's eternal redemption for us, right? And the for us is actually not in the Greek. There is no peri, huper, hemon, right? Which is for us. It just says eternal redemption, right? And so I think in context, if you look going even further, the redemption is for the transgressions under the first covenant, which is experiential, right? So the eternal redemption is probably national in that case. Not to say Christians aren't personally redeemed. That's just not what the passage is about. Now, yeah, and then Hebrews 9. Now, what is it? I talked. What's interesting is that I talked about the unshakable tabernacle. I guess we could get into that now. Um, so it says in Hebrews 8, right? In Hebrews 8:1, it actually says the main point of the book, which if you read the whole book through that main lens, I think you'll probably understand like what the point of the book is, right? Otherwise it's going to be very confusing for you. But it says that he has obtained a better ministry and he ministers in the tabernacle, which the Lord pitched and not man. First of all, a tabernacle, I said this before, a tabernacle moves with the people. A tabernacle does not stay in one particular spot. It moves with the people, just like in the wilderness, while they were traveling from Egypt to Canaan. And so when it comes to the heavenly tabernacle, the idea is that number one, the Lord pitched it, which means it can't be shaken, right? Same thing with the new Jerusalem. Man did not build that, but the Lord did, right? And so what does that mean? It means that number one, it's unshakable, and number two, it's always there when you need it, right? Which is very theologically rich, because the whole point of Hebrews is that you can always come boldly to the throne of grace, right? At literally any time, any place, anywhere, by faith and faith alone. Hebrews 10:22. So, which that's for sanctification. Interesting enough, I think people don't appreciate that. You made a distinction between tabernacle and temple. Yeah, a temple just stays in one place. A temple, like, you can only have a temple in one place in Jerusalem, but a tabernacle, you can bring it anywhere you want, right? It doesn't have to stay in one particular place. But the point is that the Lord pitched a perfect tabernacle. I think that's the point of the Hebrews 8:1. And also it's because there is no temple in heaven. Because according to Revelation 21, that there is no temple in the New Jerusalem. There's a tabernacle, and the temple is the church, right? The church is the temple of the living God. 2 Corinthians 6 and 1 Corinthians 3 make that clear. Now, and then now my thing is that about the Jesus being the better hope. I hope that one was clear, because I think that people sort of miss that, right? People miss the idea. Yeah, the point is not like, even you've seen this picture, right? He's the better guarantee. He's the better blood. He has better promises, and he's also, if you look to the left a little bit, he's the better hope. That's really what's brought in. It's through him, not through the covenant. And even Charles agreed with me on that point. I wish he can agree with me on more points, but it's fine. So yeah, now, and then Rodney Decker wants to say that it's the better covenant. I don't know how you could make that argument, though. I think that's a stretch. All it says is that he's the surety of a better covenant, that you can't derive any more than that, and than that, hey, there's going to be a covenant in the future, and he guaranteed that it's going to happen. That's all it's saying, right? That's our reason to put our trust in him, because he does what he says he promised, right? If he didn't, there's no reason to trust in him. All right. You explained the better hope well. Yeah. All right. Thanks. But now what's interesting is that I think actually Hebrews 7:3, I think it's 7:3, when it says that Melchizedek has no beginning of days nor end of days, but is made like unto the Son of God. First of all, I think that passage actually unanimously, I wouldn't say unanimously, but it very clearly demonstrates the deity. Because the thing is with Melchizedek is that in Genesis 14, I believe, you actually don't have any recorded genealogy for Melchizedek, but I believe he was an actual literal man, right? He had an actual genealogy. He was born of someone, but we just don't have that recorded, just like everyone else in 1 Chronicles 1-9 and Genesis 5, right? So in that way, he has no beginning of days nor end of days, because we don't ever see him die. But Christ clearly has an actual genealogy, right? We know it. It's from Luke chapter 3, Matthew chapter 1. So we know his genealogy. So it can't be based on that. because the point is that it's based on the power of an indestructible life. And so again, that means that Jesus in his divinity has no beginning of days nor end of days, which again, that's just what God is, right? I think that's the point. Oh, hey, theology scholar, what's up? You missed the whole presentation, man. We were talking about the new covenant in Hebrews. It's very interesting. A lot of conspiracy about Melchizedek. Do you think he's a type? Well, yeah, of course he's a type. I don't think he was Christ. I think people go too far with that. I like people go to John chapter 8 and they're like, oh, Abraham lived to see my day and was glad. And he's talking about he was blessed in Genesis 14. And I'm like, no, I don't think that's the point of that. I mean, I think that's more about Genesis 15 when he saw that he would have descendants as much as the stars of the seashore, right? As much as the stars in heaven. I think that's probably what he's referencing when he believed in God and his future, his son. But I don't think it's talking about Melchizedek, though. And so, yeah, I don't believe that Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate Christ. I think that's a bit of a stretch. I was out playing b-ball. Oh, good. Is it baseball or basketball? That's important. So, and then I talked about the Hebrews thing. I mean, just like, and this is one of my problems again with the multi-user view is that not only are there different types of multi-user views, but there's also like different ways people try to explain it, right? You have people trying to say, oh, we don't fulfill the covenant, but we benefit indirectly from the covenant. I don't really see that in the passage, but whatever. Or they'll say, well, no, we fulfill it in part, but it's not partial fulfillment. I know what that means. I don't see how you can support that, though. I don't think the text makes a distinction in types of blessings. And it's not even a general blessing thing. Like it's very specifically outlined blessings, unlike Genesis 12, verse 3, So there's that. And then people try to say, oh, well, no, we directly participate in it. And it's like, well, how though? How do you directly participate in it if you're not Israel? And wouldn't that mean that you just fulfill the covenant, like covenant theology? So I don't know. There's a lot of ways people try to accommodate for that view. Yeah, I mean, and it's also just weird, which aspects are beneficial for you? Like, is it forgiveness of sins? Because the forgiveness of sins in that passage is national, right? The people are already saved by that point in the tribulation. So, so are they going to get saved again when Jesus comes back? I think that's a stretch. And then they'll say, no, it's about the Holy Spirit. And it's like, well, if the Holy Spirit was given through the new covenant to the church, then why isn't it mentioned even in John 14 to 16, right? Where Christ talks about giving the Holy Spirit to the church. Why doesn't Paul bring it up in Titus 3 when he talks about regeneration or in the entire book of Titus, right? I mean, there's a reason these things are left out. I think it's because the Bible wants to, doesn't want to associate the giving of the Holy Spirit with the new covenant directly, at least in the church. So, yeah, I mean, it's just there's a lot of different ways people try to get around. I mean, I understand why people do it, but yeah. With Hebrews 9:15, why would the author even mention inheritance blessing? Could it not be used to say the blessings we experience are from the new covenant and not from the Abrahamic covenant? Why would the author even mention inheritance blessings? Because that's the way that Christ fulfills. Right. So when Christ died, in order to ratify the new covenant is what allows the Abrahamic covenant land promise to be fulfilled, right? It's how the Israelites come into the land and obey. And so it's relevant to that. Inheritance is all about the kingdom. Yeah. And so that's where all the covenants are fulfilled. Could it not be used with 16 to 17 say the blessings we experience are from the new covenant? No, because no blessings from the new covenant are from the new covenant are transferred to the church. You can't really also separate them either. That would be artificial, and that would just be something that you pick and choose at your own will. So, and then also, I think I didn't go into the warning passages, so it would be fine to go into it here. I don't think any of the warning passages are about eternal damnation, though. I think people try to say, oh, the judgment without mercy, being burned in Hebrews 6, drifting away in Hebrews 2, not being part of his house in Hebrews 3, not being a partaker with Christ in Hebrews 3, failing to enter his rest. There's a lot of warnings, but I don't think any of them are about hell. I think most of them are about rewards, being part of his metakoi in the kingdom, which you see in Hebrews 1, verse 9. That's when he's coronated for the Messianic kingdom, when he takes his throne. And as well, it's just about chastisements. Now, I think specifically that's in relation probably to 70 AD, but I mean, it can apply to any believer in any age, right? It's if you apostatize, you are in danger of a extremely bad disciplinary action, right? In order to bring you back from your apostasy. I think that that's the point. So, yeah. And when people try to say that it's talking about hell, well, I mean, look, you have to prove that to me, because all I see is just like, hey, God is a consuming fire. If you don't continue in the faith, then he is going to bring on that destruction in your life. That's not a problem. Who is Israel at this time? Israel is Israel. Israel is the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, from the Abrahamic covenant. Now, it's interesting. I was doing a study on like the word Israel in the Bible. So it's not a technical term, right? Now, it usually references the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but Israel can mean, again, the people that are derived from the Abrahamic covenant through Jacob. It can mean, which is the ethnic descendants. It can also mean the nation of Israel, like the theocracy itself. It can also mean like the nation in rebellion. It can mean the believers in the nation. You know, it depends on the context, right? It can also even mean Christ, like in Hosea 11 verse 1, or even Isaiah 49, right? So it can refer. It's not a technical term strictly, but I will say that it never refers to the New Testament church. There's just way too many differences between the church and Israel to make that possible. Right, go to 36, 38 and look at the verses used. But yeah, I mean, Hebrews is difficult. I mean, Hebrews is difficult for it doesn't matter what perspective you take. Hebrews is difficult. A difficult book in general, not only because of the new covenant teachings, but because of the apostasy teachings. So it's like, if you go into that book untrained in the word of righteousness, yeah, you're going to come away with erroneous conclusions. Like, for instance, our friend Jamie Russell, which I did a video on, he believes that, number one, we're under the new covenant. Number two, the church is Israel. And number three, that you can lose your salvation because of apostasy. See, he just completely missed the point of the book, right? The point of the book is not even talking about that. That's the problem. Can we point to anyone like Black Hebrew Israelites or people living in the land right now? I think only God knows. Like, if you want me to point to a specific person and say that person is a Jew, well, they may very well be a Jew, right? It's possible even the Black Hebrew Israelites could be Jews if they actually are descended from Jacob. But I only God knows that. I mean, Revelation 7 promises that there's going to be 12,000 people from each of the 12 tribes. Right now, you could spiritualize that and say that that's the church. You could go Donnie's route and say that that's about Old Testament resurrected Jews. I'm just going to take the text for what it says. It means that there's going to be 12,000 people from every tribe. So only God knows that. Only He can keep track of that. That's not my job. So I'll say that much. And so I don't know if there's any specific slide you wanted to go over, but yeah. And then what else? When it goes into the better priesthood, yeah, I mean, I said Melchizedek is a priest king, right? So Melchizedek is a priest and a king, which means, interestingly enough, that all that means is that Christ can be a priest while being a king, because you can only be a king if you're from the line of Judah, according to Genesis 49, verse 10, that the scepter will not depart from Judah until Shiloh come, which means peace. And so when it talks about, right, how our Lord descended from Judah, and no priesthood was spoken about from Judah. Yeah, that's true. And so therefore he can be a king. But priesthood is not strictly based on being a physical descendant. Right now, like being a king is, but being a priest is not, because we see in Melchizedek's day, you could be a priest even without being from a physical descendancy, right? And so in the same way, Christ, who comes from everlasting as God himself, can take on that role as the priest who comes from everlasting, right? Who has the power of an indestructible life. Um, and so, but again, just because Melchizedek is a priest king, that doesn't mean that Christ now functions as the Davidic king. I think that people try to associate them too closely, which even progressive dispensationalists like to do, but that's not the point. Have you read the Talmud and the Mishnah commentaries in Hebrews? Some interesting stuff, at least from a Jewish perspective, hermeneutic for Paul. I actually haven't read the Talmud commentaries for Hebrew. That might be interesting. I don't know what they exactly would provide, but yeah, that would be interesting to see. Although they're not Christian commentaries, right? They're from Jewish unbelievers, I think. And I will also say this, people get confused on my position. The law has not been replaced, right? There's been something better introduced, the law of Christ, but it's not been, there's something better introduced, but the law still existed and still exists because people are described, according to Paul, as being under the law. In 1 Corinthians 9, in Galatians chapter 3, you can be of the works of the law and under a curse. Israel is scattered because of her disobedience to the Mosaic law, right? So the law itself still exists, right? The theocracy still exists. They're just under Gentile rule right now, and they're being cursed. But yeah, the nation itself is still under divine discipline. But just because that's the case, that doesn't mean that the new covenant has been brought in. You can't derive it from that passage, I would say. And I think we talked about Hebrews 8 a little bit as well. The distinction between promises and promise, etc. Right? And I made the point that in Hebrews 8:13, it actually is, helps my view, because I think that it makes the point that the new covenant has not yet come in. It's not been yet abolished, right? But it's yet to be abolished. It's yet to be disappeared when the new covenant comes in, right? When the new covenant comes in, that's when the old covenant goes away, right? Because that you could just do that. So I think actually Hebrews 8 supports my position, but I know that some people disagree. Yeah, they're unbelievers, so you have to take it with huge grain of salt. Yeah, like that's what I mean. I generally don't like to read commentaries from unbelievers. I generally don't like to read commentaries from people that are not free grace. That's my conviction on that. I could in some cases, but usually I don't. But that might be interesting just to read some, like, how unbelieving Jews might see the book of Hebrews. And they're like, no, Jesus was not a better high priest. We still have the Levitical priests. And it's just like, well, good luck. Right? But what's interesting with the priesthood as well is that Christ does not fulfill the Levitical priesthood. He can't, right? He fundamentally can't fulfill the Levitical priesthood. He can't fulfill the Aaronic priesthood covenant in Numbers 25 as well. That can only be done by the descendants of Aaron. And also, of course, the Zadokian priests in Ezekiel 44. So he doesn't fulfill the priesthood. That's why the priesthood still continues in the millennial kingdom. That's why you have to have priests in the millennial kingdom, right? And so when people try to say that, they actually, they completely fall flat on their face. So when they try to make that statement, so yeah, it's not like that. It's just explaining terms and stuff, not a polemic. Oh, all right, yeah, because I know that there's a lot of stuff in Hebrews, especially verse in chapter 9, that talks about very specific stuff from the Old Covenant, and I've seen some of the commentaries on that. About how they explain some of that stuff. There's actually discrepancies there in the description of the tabernacle, right? But I think you can harmonize it still, and it's not impossible. Now, yeah, Hebrews 9 was definitely the most difficult one. And the cleansing from dead works. I don't think a lot of people think the cleansing from dead works is positional. Like they think that when you're being cleansed from dead works, that means that you're saved. No, it's for the audience. It's for the believers. It says he will cleanse your conscience from dead works in order to serve the living God. Right? So he has cleansed your so the cleansing from the conscience is when you come near to him by faith with a true heart in full assurance of faith, not by works. Right? And so when it's talking about that, it's basically saying things you try to do to cleanse your conscience, like your guilt, your personal guilt of what you've done. But the point of Jesus' blood is that no, you've already been forgiven, right? Now go and sin no more. That's the point. Um, Experiential, yeah, that's my point. Because it's connected to serving the living God, and serving the living God is connected to the eternal inheritance, right? See how that works? In fact, a good commentary I recommend is actually J. Paul Tanner's commentary. I read some of it. It's very, very good, very exegetical. I don't agree. I don't agree with his post-tribulationism in Hebrews 10, but I mean it's whatever. It's perfectly fine. But yeah, now of course I did talk about how Jesus' death in Hebrews 9:15, it does give redemption for all transgressions, right? Like in a general sense. But what it's focusing on here is the transgressions under the first covenant, which is the old covenant, right? Not all sins of all ages. So people like to say, oh, well, you're dividing Jesus' blood. Well, the text itself literally tells you what the blood is for. Right, in this passage. And so there are different purposes for Jesus' blood. You can't, like, even in 1 John 1:9, it says that he cleanses us from all unrighteousness as we confess our sins. Now, do you have to confess your sins to be saved? No, of course not. Romans 5:9 says you're already justified by his blood, right? But in this passage, in 1 John 1:9, it says you're cleansed by his blood experientially as you confess sins, right? So again, different purposes for Christ's blood for different people. I think that's the point, with different conditions and consequences, etc. Right. And I think the rest of it was pretty well explained about the will of the Father. Right. I personally don't think that actually that Christopher Cone really talked that much about the will of the Father. Right. He just sort of mentioned it passively. I tried to develop it more. I don't think when it's saying that by the which will we are sanctified is saying we are sanctified by the covenant, right? It's saying that God's will includes our sanctification as well, right? Which sanctification, I said that it's not strictly salvific. What I mean by that is that is a New Testament blessing, right? Because of Jesus's blood. That didn't exist in the Old Testament. In the Old Testament, you had to physically cleanse yourself and go through these rituals in order to enter the holiest of all once a year. But now in the New Testament, Jesus Christ, the moment we get saved by faith alone, he sanctifies us perfectly, which means that at any time we can enter the presence of God. That's the purpose of sanctification, according to Hebrews 9, right? And so I would argue that again it's positional but not salvific. I would say that, as well as the idea of the sanctified by his will. His will, that will includes taking away the first and establishing the second, but it also includes sanctifying us, which is why it can say that we're sanctified by the blood of the covenant, but not the covenant itself, right? When God said, "Go around in the land according to its length and width, for I will give you," was he walking around in our hearts or the Vatican? Exactly. Well, actually, there's an interesting debate recently between George Antonios and Robertson Jennings. Right? I really like that debate. I think it exposed some of the implications. In fact, Robertson Jennings even said, "Yeah, if you just read the Old Testament literally in its context, you would become a dispensationalist." Which to me, I think that's gold. I think that's a home run right there. But it's like the text literally just says, "I will give you this land for your inheritance." And I think a good point that George Antonios made is that, look, yes, he was looking around for a land, right? And he was looking for a way that God would fulfill it. And so he reasoned, okay, look, this land isn't much, which means that God is going to have to build a city, right, in this land and put the city in this land. I think that that's, I personally think that that's what's going on in Hebrews chapter 11. People like to say, oh, the land is spiritual now. It's New Jerusalem. Well, no, he didn't know anything about New Jerusalem. He just recognized that, look, if I'm going to have this land, but it's not fertile right now, but I'm going to get a city out of it, well, look, God is going to have to make a land for me. I think that that's what the text is trying to imply, right? Yeah, the Anakim were spiritual giants Israel had to overcome. That to me sounds like nonsense. It's like, oh yeah, the Anakim and the Philistines, they were spiritual giants, right? And so you got to overcome your spiritual giants in order to overcome the land of Canaan. And they think the land of Canaan is talking about heaven, and all that stuff. You got to overcome that to overcome sin to get into heaven. Yeah, it's just, and they connected with the overcomers in Revelation and say, if you don't overcome, you go to the second death, etc., etc. Right, ridiculous stuff. Modern day sermon in your average church. I look, church is not great nowadays. It's unfortunate. Modern day, but the wrapping it all up here. I mean, I think I've tried to make the distinction that the new covenant is not functioning right now, but it's a picture, right? It's something that you peer into to get a look into your blessings, because it's still witnesses to us, right? That is true, but there's no reason to assume it's functioning right now in the way it was intended, right? Because the way that it's supposed to be functioning is for people to be in the land, and to have very specific promises to them. So yeah, that's what I would say. So, and yeah, and then my conclusion, basically, I just quoted Hebrews 12. Personally, I think Hebrews 12 is actually like verses 22 to 24. I think it's a really, really great summation of the point of the book of Hebrews, right? Where it's basically saying, look, this is what was in the Old Testament. This is what they had to overcome. This is what they had, but you haven't come to that, right? You've come to something better. Now, most people like to say, oh, this is talking about how you've been seated in heavenly places in Christ. And, in their systematic theology, they like to say that. I don't think that's the point of this chapter. I don't think it's talking about necessarily your position in heavenly places. I think it's talking about where you minister, where you pray, where you approach the throne of God. It's actually supposed to be something very terrifying, but in a good way, right? Because it's more responsibility. It's better privilege than in the Old Testament. And so this is part of the better things that are promised for us, in the New Testament as we live our lives. But that doesn't mean that, this is talking strictly about, seated in heavenly places, that kind of stuff. But now what's interesting is that people like to say in Hebrews 11 that without us they would not be made perfect, that's talking about the rapture. I mean, I all it's saying is that we are also going to be glorified with Old Testament saints, right? But it doesn't give the timing of when it happens. I mean, technically what's going to happen is that you have a preacher rapture, in my view, and then 7 years pass, and then the Old Testament saints get resurrected from the dead, right? So yeah, they're going to be made perfect with us, but we're going to be made perfect first, physically speaking, right? So that's what I would say. And there's also a lot of other problems with post-tribulation rapture. The ancient synagogue also knows of Jerusalem, but not as in Galatians 4:26 as a congregation of community of people, but rather as a city that is built in heaven. Well, yeah, the Bible also knows about a city built in heaven, right? It says in the next few chapters that we receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, should serve with godly fear and reverence. So the kingdom that cannot be shaken was built by God in heaven. And we see that same New Jerusalem in Revelation 21 and 22, where it's explicitly meant to come down from heaven. Now, I personally believe that that's also going to be in the millennial kingdom. And so what happens is that you got the New Jerusalem comes down from heaven into the earth, So you're gonna have the old Jerusalem and the New Jerusalem. And then when you have the destruction of the earth, the New Jerusalem gets taken up, and then it comes back down again. So it kind of transfers in between, right? So that's how I would see. I could be proven wrong on that, but that's how I take it right now. But I mean, good question. Like I see there's still questions I still have about the new covenant in some areas, like related to the law and the Mosaic covenant and the Abrahamic covenant and how you interpret some passages. But I think that once we've already gone over that stuff at this point, and I don't think that there's any serious objection you can give to Israel only that doesn't already have a presumption in there, right? So yeah. Now let me see. Because I gotta. But yeah, I mean, I think that I've answered all the questions I had about it with the Lord's Supper, the ministers of a new covenant. That one was confusing but very satisfying as well. I even had to redo that one. That was good. But it's like this was supposed to be the granddaddy of them all. You know, the Hebrews. Oh, everyone goes to Hebrews. And you know, Hebrews 8 and 10 especially, right? But it's like, well, you read through it, you read through the book, you go through you process it yourself. I mean, I've had to reread every chapter twice. So, you know, you really go deep into it, and it's like, yeah, I mean, it doesn't prove we're under the new covenant at all. And no passage proves that. And since the Bible in the Old Testament consistently affirms it's for Israel in the future, and since Romans 11 explicitly connects it with the future salvation of Israel in verses 26 to 27, I don't have any reason to see that it's enforced today in terms of we're getting blessings directly from it. So, I mean, yeah, that's an interesting view of New Jerusalem. Yeah, I mean, I actually got it from Ashley. Well, I didn't get it from Ashley. Ashley, she helped me sort out some stuff. But yeah, I mean, people usually think the New Jerusalem comes down in the new heaven and new earth only. No, I think that it's definitely part of what's going to be in the millennial kingdom. I think that's the point. But oh, Charles is already here. I didn't even see. What's up?
Yeah. Hey, thanks for doing this, man. I'm glad it's benefiting you, and I know it's benefiting others. You know,
Yeah.
and we'll keep at it.
Yeah. All right. But you know, wait, were you listening in? Do you have any comments you wanted to say? You know?
No, I was listening when I was driving home, and I think you did well. I didn't get to hear everything, but no, I look forward to watching all these at once. Been watching them like it's Netflix, and studying them all, and getting back with you on that. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. Thanks a
Yeah,
lot. You want to land the plane?
yeah, I'll just land it right now. I can't exit out or else it's gonna glitch out. But
That's
basically,
all right.
guys, just you're gonna have to do so I'm gonna make a covenant with you. Okay. The covenant is this. It's that if you like the video, if you subscribe, if you if you smash that notification, I hate saying that. If you smash that notification bell, if you comment about how awful I did and how I need to improve, okay, and if you share it, then I'm gonna bless you with an even better presentation next time. It's gonna be interesting. In fact, as a sneak peek, what's gonna happen is that we're gonna go into some of the social implications of the new covenant, as well as Reconstruction theology. Nobody's gonna care, but it's still interesting. Um, so yeah, just watch more content and hopefully have a good night.
God bless, guys. Thank y'all. Keep watching content, old stuff and new stuff. It's all good.